There was a strategic battle in Japan as Verstappen got back into the routine of comfortable victories. But behind the Red Bulls, there was a battle all weekend as the teams fought it out to be the second fastest team. There's a lot to talk about, so here's my 5 things we learned from the Japanese Grand Prix. My name's Andy, and this is Behind the Drive. Verstappen's routine continues. After an abrupt and unexpected setback in Australia, Verstappen quickly got his season back on track in Japan in the flawless style we've all grown accustomed to. Verstappen once again took pole ahead of his teammate and subsequently cruised to the race win. The Dutch driver was unfazed by his disappointing result in Australia, where a brake failure dropped him out of the running. Verstappen's dominance won't be stopped for the rest of the year. He seems to have the car to deliver on every circuit type, as the Red Bull team have delivered a car that is perhaps even more dominant than last year's. The 2023 car did look beatable in qualifying trim towards the end of the season, but as this season has gone on, it's Red Bull that has secured every pole position so far. It seems like there's a long way to go for the rest of the teams to even catch Perez, let alone the 3-time world champion. So once again, it's a green box for Verstappen, who's having an incredible season once again. Perez gets back on track. And while Verstappen remains dominant at the front, Perez has recovered well after a disappointing run to 5th in Australia with 4 slower cars ahead of him. That opportunity in Australia that was gifted to him after reliability challenges for Verstappen was the one that got away for Perez, despite the fact that he's been second to Verstappen in every other race. In Japan, Perez was fantastic. In what is a relatively long lap time, he was just 0.07 of a second behind Verstappen in Q3, which is one of the smallest gaps that he's had to Verstappen on a Saturday since the pair have been teammates. There have been situations where Perez has had a strong weekend, where he gets comfortable in the car and can extract a good amount of pace from it. Admittedly, these often come at street circuits, so it's good to see Perez deliver at Suzuka. To be honest, for this championship to have any competition, Perez needs to step it up again and make these performances more consistent, so he might occasionally be able to compete for race victories. Either way, despite being in the mix with other competing cars through his strategy this weekend, Perez has delivered and has done what the Red Bull team needs him to do. It certainly feels like he's driving to keep hold of his seat in the best car on the grid following his hiccup 2 weeks ago in Australia, so it's a green box for the Mexican driver. Sainz is continuing to prove Ferrari wrong. Ferrari made the bold decision to drop Carlos Sainz for next year as they recruited Lewis Hamilton. However, the Spanish driver has responded to this situation by being determined to prove his team wrong. Once again, Sainz outqualified Leclerc, with the Monegasque driver taking 8th on the grid and Sainz taking 4th. This difference was just 1/10 of a second, but in the closely fought group behind Red Bull, that is all that makes the difference. It meant Sainz would be in the better starting position, and the Ferrari car has got significantly better through the winter in terms of managing tyres and controlling the race pace. As such, the Ferrari of Sainz could be confident that he could move forward from his starting position, and this is exactly what he did. He made progress through good strategic decisions and found himself in a position to be on fresher tyres chasing down Lando Norris and Charles Leclerc towards the end of the race, and he managed it comfortably with a significant tyre differential to both drivers. It's the 3rd podium of the year for Sainz in as many races, and it's the 2nd time that he's been 3rd behind both of the Red Bull drivers. This is a brilliant showing, and he's doing well to ensure that he's at the top of the list for the teams with vacant seats in 2025. The differences between Sainz and Leclerc over the last few years has been consistency and qualifying pace, and it seems that this year Sainz has improved both. Perhaps being dropped by the team has motivated him even more to deliver on expectations and be the top Ferrari driver. Since the end of 2022, Sainz is the only non-Red Bull driver to win races, and he's the one who seems to be on the heels of the Red Bulls each week, which is great for his stock in the sport. Charles Leclerc also had a strong race, moving from 8th to 4th. He did this through a differential strategy, making the one-stop work. It was one of the times where the Ferrari strategy team actually did an excellent job, and this is something that needs to be recognised. Since Fred Vasseur has taken over the team, there have been some small incremental improvements that is bringing the team back to the front. For me, they are clearly the team with the best chance of bridging the gap to Red Bull in the coming years. On the whole, the Ferrari team are in a great place, and it's almost a shame that they're dropping Sainz at the end of the year. But in the meantime, they have one of the strongest driver pairings on the grid, and both are performing well. So it's a green box for Sainz for his performance in Japan. And if you want to see Sainz get a better seat for next year, i.e. moving to the Red Bulls, then make sure you subscribe to learn more by watching Behind the Drive. The RB battle of the drivers continues. Daniel Ricciardo's F1 career feels like it's at risk after some disappointing races to start this season. The driver has struggled throughout 2024 to compete with Yuki Tsunoda, and he's even suggested that his chassis is not equal to Tsunoda's, alongside his comment to describe the whole situation as a mystery. This is never a good sign. It suggests Ricciardo is unsure of what the problem is and therefore how to solve it. And this emerged in Japan once again. Tsunoda was ahead of Ricciardo all weekend, and the Japanese driver snuck into Q3 by being half a tenth faster than his teammate in Q2. What's great to see is the fact that the RB is starting to fight for 6th in the championship. With Lance Stroll being the vulnerable driver out of the top 5 teams, there's typically one spot available from the other teams to make it into the top 10 drivers. Yuki Tsunoda has to be credited with some brilliant performances this year. If there's any chance of an RB driver being given the opportunity to race in the Red Bull next season, then it feels like it's Tsunoda that should be the frontrunner right now. Tsunoda scored 6 points in Australia following Alonso's penalty, and he followed this up with back-to-back point-scoring finishes in Japan as he converted 10th on the grid to 10th at the finish, which was actually a challenging race for the team as strategy played a significant part in the team's ability to keep Tsunoda in that place. On the other hand, Ricciardo's race ended soon after it started. Heading into turn 3, Ricciardo saw Lance Stroll on his left, and as such, he moved to the right side of the circuit. Meanwhile, Alex Albon, on softer tyres, was trying to go around the outside of Ricciardo and ended up in the closing space, and in the Australian driver's blind spot. The crash was deemed to be a racing incident by the stewards, but they recognised that this was due to the fact that it took place on the opening lap, and that Lance Stroll was coming down the inside of the Red Bull car. Either way, it was the last thing Daniel Ricciardo needed in a race where there was a point up for grabs for the backmarker teams. Ricciardo is almost certainly at risk of being dropped by the Red Bull-owned setup. He's failed to deliver on the expectations of the team and is not proving himself as the obvious successor to Sergio Perez. It feels like he's lost the momentum and he's struggling to manage it. The Australian driver will get a new chassis soon, something that I'm sure he hopes will change the trajectory of his season and gets him ahead of Tsunoda. If that doesn't work, then Liam Lawson is waiting in the wings to take that seat. On the whole, I'm going to be positive for this section on the RB drivers and give a green box to Tsunoda. It's 2 races in a row where the Japanese driver has scored points and he's delivering on expectations. It'll be fascinating to see if this turns into something that the Red Bull setup recognises and promotes the young driver. Mercedes clearly have a temperamental car. Mercedes had what Lewis Hamilton described as their best session of the year on Friday as the team finished 4th and 5th in FP1 with lap times that were around half a second behind the Red Bulls. It was a strong result and it looked like the Mercedes team had found something to make this car work. But despite following this up with 3rd and 4th in FP3, both Mercedes drivers looked lost in qualifying. Hamilton ended up 7th and Russell ended up 9th, with both drivers struggling to get more out of their car. It's a familiar sight this season, with the Mercedes car clearly being temperamental and unpredictable. The drivers are finding themselves in a position where they're experimenting to find different ways to improve the pace of the car, and this is having little impact on the outcome of pace on the track. The issue is the fact that the problems that they're facing are relating to the car bottoming out through high-speed corners, and the drivers having little confidence of the rear end of the car. This is something that all teams faced in 2022, but they were issues that most got on top of quickly and found a solution for. It feels like Mercedes have got themselves into a tricky position with their 3rd successive car that has this kind of issue. It's disappointing for the team and frustrating for the drivers as they seem to have a car that's incapable of putting themselves in the mix with the other top teams, and they seem a long way away from a podium finish. In Japan, this promising practice resulted in a disappointing race. The drivers finished 7th and 9th, with Russell getting ahead of Hamilton and Piastri, with Hamilton dropping back. This was the worst finishing position in a Japanese Grand Prix for Hamilton of his entire career, and this shows just how disappointing their race really was. Mercedes are a team that should be able to solve this issue. However, with this problem being similar to one that they faced over the last 2 years, hope is waning for the drivers and team as they seem to not be able to get to grips with the ground effect aerodynamic era of Formula 1. So of course, it's a red box for Mercedes. Honourable mentions. I think Lando Norris is deserving of an honourable mention this weekend. The race in Japan was an opportunity to directly compare the strong part of McLaren's 2023 season to 2024, and the British driver quickly put it to third on the grid and subsequently maximised his finishing position with just the faster Ferrari cars working their way past him. It was a brilliant effort and another point to prove that he's continuing to be a step ahead of Oscar Piastri this season. So it was a strategic race in Japan with little competition right at the front, but there's still lots of interesting storylines in the drivers behind. If you want to learn more about where they could be moving this year, watch this video next.